Number 10. Eileen Warnos. Eileen Warnos was a serial executioner. While working on the streets selling her body to depraved men, she managed to slaughter 7 men. She's broken the glass ceiling on eliminating multiple people. Eileen is a terrifying criminal, and she had multiple freakouts during interviews. Like that time she said when she passed away, she would be sent to a UFO, and that she feels bad for all of us on Earth because in 2019 a meteor would strike us and send us to extinction. Besides that, what was her last meal request? Well, who could just board a UFO without their morning cup of joe? Get it? Morning? For real though. Eileen ordered a single cup of coffee for her last meal. Kinda sad actually. At number 9, Philip Workman. In 1988, at 28 years old, Workman was living with his wife and daughter in Columbus, Georgia, and was heavily addicted to a white powdery substance. That summer, he hitchhiked to Memphis, where on August 5th, 1981, he robbed a Wendy's restaurant with a .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol. During the robbery, an employee of the restaurant triggered a silent alarm after Workman granted her request to stand up to relieve a cramp in her leg. 3 Memphis police officers, Ronald Oliver, Aubrey Stoddard, and Stephen Parker, responded to the alarm. Upon their arrival, Workman attempted to flee across a nearby parking lot, then shot his pistol at them and ended Lieutenant Ronald Oliver's life. During his time on Demise Row, he warmed his heart a little, and for his last meal, he asked for a vegetarian pizza to be donated to a homeless person in Nashville. The police denied this request, but many pizzas were donated to the homeless when the public got word of his wish. Number 8. Ricky Ray Rector. Before we get into this criminal's backstory, can we address how much of a supervillain name he has? Ricky Ray Rector? Anyways, on March 21st, 1981, Rector and some friends drove to a dance hall at Tommy's old-fashioned home-style restaurant in Conway. When one friend could not pay the $3 cover charge and was refused entry, Rector became incensed and pulled a .38 caliber pistol from his waistband. He fired several shots, wounding 2 and executing a third man named Arthur D. Criswell, who passed away almost instantly after being struck in the throat and forehead. Villainous. While awaiting his demise sentence, Rector attempted to take his own life, but failed. His last meal was steak, fried chicken, cherry Kool-Aid, and pecan pie. Where it gets interesting is that he had brain damage from his previous attempt on his life, and when he couldn't finish his pie, he said he would save it for later, before being escorted into the last room he would ever be in. Number 7. Timothy McVeigh. Timothy James McVeigh was a veteran of the Gulf conflict who went on to commit extreme acts of violence. He was responsible for the 1995 Oklahoma City tragedy that executed 168 people, injured more than 680 others, and destroyed 1/3 of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. McVeigh sought revenge against the federal government for the 1993 Waco siege, as well as the 1992 Ruby Ridge incident and American foreign policy. He hoped to inspire a revolution against the federal government, and defended the tragedy as a legitimate tactic against what he saw as a tyrannical government. What did this remorseless criminal want for his last meal? 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. It's not a completely insane request, but from the man who managed to end the lives of 168 people, ice cream is a pretty jolly request. Number 6. Robert Alton Harris. Robert Alton Harris was an American car thief, burglar, kidnapper, and executioner who was executed at San Quentin State Prison in 1992 for his 1978 removal of 2 men in San Diego. His execution was the first in the state of California since 1967. Harris was born in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and was abused as a child. He had run-ins with the police as early as age 10 and was first placed into juvenile detention at age 13 for stealing a car. His mother abandoned him at age 14, and he was soon after placed into juvenile detention after stealing another car. Following his release, he found work, married, and had a son. In 1975, he was imprisoned for manslaughter and paroled in January 1978. On July 5th, 1978, Harris and his younger brother commandeered a car occupied by 2 people, John Majewski and Michael Baker, ordered them to drive to a remote area, then ended their lives. What did he get for his last meal? A 21-piece bucket of KFC, 2 large Domino's pizzas, ice cream, a bag of jelly beans, a 6-pack of Pepsi, and a pack of Camel cigarettes. That's a lot of food, and cigarettes for some reason. Number 5. Alan Lee Davis. Alan Lee Davis was an American executioner who was executed for the May 11th, 1982 execution of Nancy Wheeler in Jacksonville, Florida. According to reports, Nancy Wheeler was beaten almost beyond recognition by Davis with a .357 Magnum and hit more than 25 times in the face and head. Davis, who had a lengthy criminal record, was on parole for armed robbery at the time of the executions. This guy is a real piece of work. I had to remove some stuff in the video, but he truly is a monster. What was his last meal request? Lobster tail, fried potatoes, fried shrimp and clams, a half loaf of garlic bread, and 32 ounces of A&W root beer. I almost wish he choked on all that food. Number 4, Victor Fugger. Victor Harry Fugger was a convicted executioner and the last federal inmate executed in the United States before the moratorium on the execution penalty following Furman v. Georgia, and the last person put to demise in the state of Iowa. While the media did not pay much attention to Fugger or his execution at the time, Timothy McVeigh's execution sparked renewed media interest in him. But what did he want for food? That's the real question. Well, this guy was certainly not healthy mentally. He requested a single olive with the pit inside. What's the point of that? Number 3, Thomas J. Grasso. This guy went all out for his last meal. Steamed clams and mussels, a Burger King double cheeseburger, barbecue spare ribs, 2 strawberry milkshakes, half a pumpkin pie, and a can of SpaghettiOs. However, there was a slight controversy when Thomas J. Grasso received his final meal. While Grasso requested SpaghettiOs at room temperature, he instead received regular spaghetti and meatballs. Oh, his poor soul. As he noted in a later public statement. His last words were actually, "I didn't get my SpaghettiOs. I want the public to know this." The guy had a grudge. He really wanted those SpaghettiOs. Number 2, James Edward Smith. On March 7th, 1983, Smith approached a teller's window at the Union National Life Insurance Company in Houston, Texas. Armed with a gun and wearing a stocking mask, Smith slid open the glass and pointed the weapon at the teller, ordering her to hand over all of the money. When she refused and hid behind a filing cabinet, Smith turned his attention to 44-year-old Larry Don Roas, the company's district manager who had been standing with her. Roas complied with Smith's demands and retrieved money from the cash drawer, which he then handed over to Smith in a plastic bag. As Roas walked away, Smith ordered him to return to the window. While the two engaged in conversation, Roas pleaded with Smith not to shoot him and began taking off a bracelet on his wrist. Smith then fired 2 shots, with the second hitting Roas in the upper left side of the chest. Roas was rushed to the hospital where he passed away several hours later. Smith's last meal request was a lump of dirt. Really. He was denied this request and settled on a yogurt cup. At number 1, John Wayne Gacy. Gacy performed as a clown to entertain children during events and birthday parties and to raise money for charity. His clown alias was Pogo the Clown, but while he was in costume, his demeanor changed from a happy face painter to a remorseless criminal. Gacy tortured and executed 33 people, usually men, between January 1972 and late 1978. For his very last meal, Gacy went for something both unhealthy and healthy at the same time. Fried shrimp, a bucket of KFC, French fries, and strawberries. I'm not sure the pairing of fried foods with fresh strawberries is a good combination, but oh well, his choice. Number 10, Timothy Joseph McGee. A convicted serial executioner and Toonerville Reefa 13 gang member from the Atwater Village neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. He is alleged to be responsible for at least 12 executions between 1997 and 2001, 3 of which led to convictions. McGee is also suspected of at least 10 attempted executions, 4 of which led to convictions. In 2018, the Los Angeles Times named McGee one of the top 20 most notorious executioners in the history of California, a list that included the likes of Charles Manson, the Golden State Butcher, and the Night Stalker. This guy was definitely placed in a high security prison. They're mostly reserved for the worst of the worst, like multiple slaughterers and escapees. If this guy was on my cell block, I think I'd hide. Number 9, Larry Raynes. On May 30th, 1964, Larry, posing as a hitchhiker, was given a lift by 30-year-old Gary Albert Smock, a Plymouth school teacher passing through Kalamazoo. During this trip, Raynes brandished a weapon and forced Smock to leave the car and climb into the trunk, where he subsequently locked him in. While continuing the trip, Smock attempted to get out of the car, after which Raynes stopped the car, tied him up, and then shot him twice in the back of the head. He then stole $3 and other items of material value before leaving the car on the side of the road, where it was discovered a few hours later by a police officer. Over the next few months, Raynes told a number of acquaintances about the execution, due to which he was arrested in the early morning of June 5th, 1964, in front of his friend's house. He offered no resistance during his arrest and readily admitted to removing Smock with incriminating evidence, such as a watch and shoes, later identified as belonging to Smock by relatives and friends. When he was taken to the police station, Raynes told police that he had executed 4 others during holdups at various gas stations. He confessed to the May 30th execution of 33-year-old Charles E. Snyder in Elkhart, Indiana, the execution of an Air Force serviceman in Paw Paw, Michigan, the execution of a man in Las Vegas, Nevada, and another man in Kentucky. Number 8, we have Bobby Bostic. Bobby Bostic and his friend saw a few people giving presents to the needy around Christmas time, handing out a Christmas tree and an old couch to those who needed it more. Bobby and his friend ran out of the house where they were at, weapons in hand after inhaling substances, and pointed the weapons at a woman taking the cushions from the couch out of her car. A man yelled at them, and so they turned their attention towards the man, who was the woman's boyfriend. After refusing to give money to the pair, Bobby fired at the man, which grazed him thankfully. He handed them his money and the two ran off to find another victim. They found a woman moving packages out of her car into her house when they put the weapon to her head and told her to give them her keys and get in the car. The pair drove off with the woman and robbed her of her possessions before dropping her off at some random alley. They were both arrested an hour later, and Bobby was sentenced to 241 years after denying several plea deals, which could have reduced his sentence by as much as 211 years. He said that as soon as he heard the judge tell him that he would pass in prison, the gravity of the situation suddenly hit him. Number 7, Alfred George Hines. Hines was an amazing escape artist. He escaped from Nottingham prison after sneaking through the locked doors and over a 20-foot prison wall, for which he became known in the press as Houdini Hines. He worked as a builder-decorator in Ireland and throughout Europe until his arrest by detectives of Scotland Yard in 1956, after 248 days as a fugitive. After his arrest, Hines brought a lawsuit against authorities, charging the prison commissioners with illegal arrest, and used the incident as a means to plan his next escape by having a padlock smuggled into him while he was at the law court. 2 guards escorted him to the toilet, but when they removed his handcuffs, Hines bundled the men into the cubicle and snapped the padlock onto screw eyes that his accomplices had earlier fixed to the door. He escaped into the crowd on Fleet Street, but was captured at an airport 5 hours later. Hines would make his 3rd escape from Chelmsford prison less than a year later. He then returned to Ireland, where he lived for 2 years as a used car salesman under the name William Herbert Bishop, before his arrest after being stopped in an unregistered car. Needless to say, they tightened up security around him after all that. Number 6, Antonio Ferreira. Ferreira, 35, who emigrated to France with his family in the 1980s, was in Fresnes prison in Val-de-Marne, having been jailed for bank robbery. He escaped when a gang set fire to cars in the local area to create a diversion, before raking the guard posts with automatic rifles and smashing down the door and interior walls with rocket launchers. They gave Ferreira explosives that allowed him to blow off the bars of his cell. He had previously arranged to commit a minor act of disobedience so as to be placed in a punishment wing, which was well located for his escape. It took 3 days of deliberations for the verdict to be announced at the Cour d'Assises de Paris after a 10-week trial. In total, 18 accomplices were sentenced, while 2 suspects were acquitted. Punishments ranged from suspended sentences to a variety of jail terms, including 4 of 15 years each. The men were convicted of crimes including aiding and abetting escape, destroying goods with explosives, burning cars, and transporting weapons. After the escape, security tightened up around them, often monitored almost 24 hours of the day. Number 5, Jason Barnum. The eyeball man, Jason Barnum, was sentenced to 22 years in prison for shooting an Alaska police officer. Barnum's offenses were driven by a serious substance addiction, reports The Independent. What made him seem even more dangerous and intimidating was his tattoo-filled visage. Barnum had one of his eyeballs completely tattooed. The shooting happened when police were investigating home burglaries and car thefts. Officers were inspecting a hotel in 2012 when Barnum opened fire from a bathroom. 2 officers shot back, striking Barnum in the arm, and 1 officer was injured. Barnum later admitted to committing thefts and burglaries to feed a substance addiction. Number 4, Thomas Silverstein. Thomas Edward Silverstein was an American criminal who spent the last 42 years of his life in prison after being convicted of 4 separate executions while in prison for armed robbery, one of which was overturned. Silverstein spent the last 36 years of his life in solitary confinement for executing corrections officer Merle Klutz at the Marion Penitentiary in Illinois. Prison authorities described him as a brutal executioner and a former leader of the Aryan Brotherhood prison gang. Silverstein maintains that the dehumanizing conditions inside the prison system contributed to the 3 executions he committed. He was held in a specially designed cell in what is called Range 13 at ADX Florence Federal Penitentiary in Colorado. He was the longest held prisoner in solitary confinement within the Bureau of Prisons at the time of his passing. Many prison guards refused to talk to Silverstein out of respect for Klutz. Silverstein was known as the most well-guarded prisoner in the US. Number 3, El Chapo. El Chapo, who is wanted in the United States, has always gotten his way. His appetite for freedom has been described in various psychological reports, and his casual manner of bribing officials is legendary. El Chapo is now under a draconian system with continued surveillance, without any blind spots. dogs, reinforced ground, etc., said Alejandro Hope, former Mexican intelligence agency director. But it is evident that he is going to do all he can to undermine those obstacles. In 2001, Guzman escaped from the Puente Grande prison by hiding inside a laundry cart. 62 prison officials who were paid off were charged for helping him escape. He survived on the run for 8 years, living the life of a rich substance kingpin. Number 2, Robert P. Hansen. Robert P. Hansen was an FBI agent for 25 years, from 1976 to 2001. During that time, he sold thousands of classified documents to Soviet and Russian intelligence, pocketing at least $1.4 million by the time he was caught in 2001. Hansen pled guilty to 14 counts of espionage and 1 of conspiracy to commit espionage, and was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms. Hansen's treason was called possibly the worst intelligence disaster in US history by William H. Webster, the chairman of the Commission for the Review of FBI Security Programs. Robert Hansen is currently being held at ADX Florence, where the cells are completely blocked off. Inmates are watched 24/7, and they only get 1 hour out of the cell to work out. At number 1, Michael Swango. Michael Swango was a physician who spent most of the 1980s and 90s using his medical license to poison patients and sometimes colleagues. Despite thoroughly creeping out plenty of people by the time he earned his degree from Southern Illinois University School of Medicine, including being caught faking checkups during OBGYN rotations, Swango secured an internship at what was then known as the Ohio State University Medical Center in 1983. This is where his prolific career as a serial executioner would purportedly begin. It is believed that Swango executed more than 60 people, often by poisoning them with arsenic or intentionally overdosing them with something they were prescribed. Though he could only be charged with 4 executions, Swango was sentenced to life in prison in 2000. He is also spending time at ADX Florence. Talk about a mad doctor, right? At number 10, Jimmy Glass. Jimmy was a high school dropout with a criminal record in Arkansas. In December 1982, Jimmy and another inmate, Jimmy Wingo, escaped from jail and went on to execute elderly couple Newt and Eileen Brown at their home on Christmas Eve. The Brown's son, Gary Lamar Brown, was the son-in-law of Judge Charles A. Marvin of the Louisiana Court of Appeal for the Second Circuit, based in Shreveport. Glass and Wingo were soon arrested. Both were sentenced to execution in the electric chair. Before being electrocuted, Jimmy Glass was asked for his last words. He replied with this: "I'd rather be fishing," which is so far removed from his situation that his sanity should probably be called into question. Though, to be fair, I guess fishing is better than being electrocuted. At number 9, Jeffrey David Matthews. Jeffrey David Matthews had his execution postponed 3 times, twice by the governor of Oklahoma to further investigate his claims of innocence, and once due to the controversy surrounding the substances they were going to administer to him. Matthews was indicted for the 1994 execution of his great-uncle, Otis Earl Short, after he and an accomplice robbed his home. Matthews shot Short in the back of the head and slit his wife's throat, but she managed to survive. His last words were in reference to the Oklahoma governor. "I think that governor's phone is broke. He hadn't called yet," he said before his execution. At number 8, George Apple. John George Apple was an Australian politician, lawyer, and farmer. He served from 1908 to 1929 as a delegate for the electoral district of Albert, and from 1909 to 1915 as the Secretary of Mine and Public Works, and Home Secretary of Queensland. Apple was convicted of the heinous crime that is execution in the first degree, although little is actually known about said execution. While being strapped into the electric chair, George Apple found the situation suddenly humorous, laughing during the tightening of his restraints. His last words were this: "Well, gentlemen, you are about to see a baked apple." These words quickly spread through the public and became more remembered than his actual crime. At number 7, Robert Charles Towery. Robert Charles Towery was executed through lethal injection, which is ironic considering he was charged for injecting battery acid into his victim before strangling him to execution in a 1991 robbery. That's a bit extreme. The victim was a philanthropist who loaned money to Towery on several occasions and used him as his mechanic, which is, I'm pretty sure, the definition of "don't bite the hand that feeds." During Towery's last moments, he apologized to the victim's family and cursed his bad mistakes. His last words are, "I love my family, potato, potato, potato." The potato reference was a secret message to his nephew. It is a sound that a Harley-Davidson motorcycle makes while the engine is idle, and is a way of saying that everything is okay. At number 6, George Engel. George Engel was an immigrant from Germany who had lost faith in the political process and joined the International Working People's Association. In 1886, a big rally filled to the brim of raging anarchists and labor activists turned violent when a makeshift explosive device was thrown at the police there at the time. The explosion sent 7 people to an early grave. Although nobody could figure out who threw the bottle, and Engel was at home playing cards at the time of the explosion, he took the fall for his anarchist brethren and was convicted of execution, subsequently sending him to the gallows. Before being hung, these were his last words: "Hurrah for anarchy! This is the happiest moment of my life." At number 5, Patrick Bryan Knight. In 1991, Patrick Bryan Knight and an accomplice hunted down and kidnapped their next-door neighbors. The 2 perpetrators locked the neighbors in their basement, and the following night, Patrick Bryan Knight blindfolded them, drove them to a secluded area where no one was looking, and shot the neighbors. While waiting for his execution, Patrick Knight used a website, forums, and mail to ask for the best jokes he could use for a final statement. He decided to name several inmates he believed were innocent and used his own joke. "Not all of us are innocent, but those are. I said I was going to tell a joke. Demise had set me free. That's the biggest joke. I deserve this. And the other joke is that I am not Patrick Bryan Knight, and y'all can't stop this execution now. Go ahead, I'm finished." At number 4, Sarah Goode. Goode was accused of witchcraft on March 6, 1692, when Abigail Williams and Elizabeth Parris, related to the Reverend Samuel Parris, claimed to be bewitched under her hand. The young girls asserted that they had been bitten, pinched, and otherwise abused. They would have fits in which their bodies would appear to involuntarily convulse, their eyes rolling back into their heads and their mouths hanging open. When the Reverend Samuel Parris asked, "Who torments you?" the girls eventually shouted out the names of 3 townspeople: Tituba, Sarah Osborne, and Sarah Goode. Sarah Goode was sent to burn, her last words being this: "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." At number 3, Douglas Roberts. Douglas Roberts claimed he was stoned out of his mind when he robbed and took out Jerry Velez in San Antonio, Texas on May 18, 1996. In a videotaped interview with police, Roberts gave a complete confession stating that he repeatedly stabbed Velez and then ran over the victim's body with his car. A jury convicted Roberts of capital execution in January 1997. "I've been hanging around this popsicle stand way too long. I want to tell you all. When I go, bury me deep. Lay 2 speakers at my feet, put some headphones on my head, and rock and roll me when I'm gone. I'll see you in heaven someday," Roberts said with a smile seconds before the lethal substances were administered on April 20th, 2005. At number 2, Carl Panzram. Carl Panzram was one of the most vicious and remorseless criminals to have ever walked the earth, as he was a convicted serial executioner, arsonist, and burglar in the 1920s. In fact, in his own words, he wrote, "In my lifetime, I have removed 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I have committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all these things, I am not in the least bit sorry." Ready for his last words? "Hurry it up, you hose-eared bastard. I could hang a dozen men while you're screwing around." Wow, this guy is a certified menace. At number 1, Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer was most notably the Milwaukee cannibal. The man removed 17 men from the earth to satisfy his sick and twisted thirst for blood. He then consumed some of them and even performed wicked experiments on his victims. Jeffrey was a disturbed man, often beaten as a child and neglected. He performed his first atrocity when he picked up a hitchhiker and took him somewhere under the guise of inhaling substances. He then hit the man in the head with a weight and disposed of him. His final words was said just before he got his comeuppance from a fellow prisoner in 1994. "I don't care if I live or not. Go ahead and remove me," he said before being beaten to expiration. At number 10, overcrowding. Thousands of inmates are housed in supermax facilities. Most of these facilities are, however, overcrowded. Often multiple dangerous inmates are held in the same cell, one that is tiny compared to normal cells. The issues associated with prison overcrowding are not new and have been brewing for many years. In many prison systems, detainees do not have the minimum space requirements recommended by international standards, and in some cases spending up to 23 hours of the day, if not all day, in overcrowded cells. Overcrowding can be so severe that prisoners sleep in shifts, on top of each other, share beds, or tie themselves to window bars so that they can sleep while standing. At number 9, how many guards there really are. This one is more scary for the guards than the inmates. Most prisons, like I said, are very, very overcrowded. This means that there is a huge disparity in the number of guards and inmates. Sometimes the ratio of guards to inmates is as crazy as only 1 guard to 100 inmates. This means that if things got out of hand, perhaps during a prison break, riot, or even just a fight, the guards could be overwhelmed. This has happened before and could happen in the future as well. Although the conditions in supermax facilities are hard for prisoners, that doesn't mean they can't find a way to cause chaos. If a fight or a riot were to ensue, the entire prison could be engulfed in it, and the guards would be beaten. At number 8, amnesties. In some countries, only periodic amnesties and pardons relieve overcrowding. While these provide short-term relief, they do not offer a sustainable solution and can erode public confidence in the criminal justice system. In others, costly prison building programs are undertaken to meet the growing demands for prison places. In 2020, many prison systems announced unprecedented mass releases of people in prison to reduce overcrowding and the risk of the transmission of a virus in places of detention. I'm not so sure how effective an amnesty is for overcrowding, but letting the most violent criminals closer to society is probably not a good idea. At number 7, what you do in them. Prisoners of maximum security prisons across the world almost all share one thing in common. They always have nothing to do. Most of the supermax prisons all have very strict rules against prisoners doing things. Inmates have 23 hours in their cells every day with only 1 hour per day in a different cell designed for working out. Reports state that sometimes on the weekends they don't even get the 1 hour to work out and instead just stay in their cells for the entire day. Another report says that some prisons around the world don't allow prisoners to even sit or lay in their beds after they wake up. They must stand in their cells doing almost nothing at all. At number 6, hygiene. One correctional officer has this to say about the smell inside of a maximum security prison. Having a bunch of adult individuals in such close quarters can breed some insane smells. I'm sure you can imagine, it's almost like living in a locker room. Ew. One report says that sometimes the inmates aren't even allowed to shower. If they are allowed to shower, it's only once a week. I personally couldn't handle that. I don't know anyone who could. At number 5, the most infamous supermax prison, ADX Florence. El Chapo has escaped from prison twice while being held by Mexican authorities in 2015 and 2001. But ADX is different. Nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies, no one has escaped the facility located in the high desert about 2 hours south of Denver since it has opened in 1994. Inmates are housed in soundproof 7 by 12 foot cells for 23 hours of the day in permanent lockdown, with no contact with other inmates. Staff members are carefully vetted and have little direct contact with inmates. At number 4, how it feels to be in one. Current C1 columnist Robert Hood, who served as ADX warden from 2002 to 2005, described life in ADX in stark terms to CNN. As soon as they come through the door, you see it in their faces. That's when it really hits you. You're looking at the beauty of the Rocky Mountains in the backdrop. When you get inside, that is the last time you will ever see it. The Supermax is life after passing. It's long term. In my opinion, it's far much worse than passing away. And that's the opinion of a warden there. Imagine what the prisoners think. At number 3, how many supermax prisons there are. In the United States, there is only one supermax facility left standing today. That prison is ADX Florence, the same prison where El Chapo, as mentioned before, will spend the rest of his life. In Florence, Colorado, the prison houses up to only 400 inmates, all with an extremely good reason to be there. Prisoners there include Dzhokhar Tsarnaev and Zacarias Moussaoui. I can't say who they are, but if you know, you know. At number 2, what they do to the prisoners. Supermax prisons around the world have always been known for their poor treatment of inmates. Usually that would include torture, either physical or mental. The fact that they would never see the outside world again alone would completely break the prisoners almost to a point of no return. This mental torture would spiral them into being completely emotionless and hollow or turn them extremely violent. At number 1, the security. All cells are soundproofed to try and prevent prisoners from communicating with one another. The windows are 4x4 and are designed to prevent inmates from knowing their specific location within the complex. They can see only the sky and the roof through them, so it is virtually impossible to plan an escape. Those who are in a supermax prison are placed not as a punishment of their crimes, but by their previous history when incarcerated or based on reliable evidence of an impending disruption, such as a gang leader or the leader of a radical movement. These decisions are made as administrative protection measures, and the prisoners in a supermax are deemed by correctional workers as a threat to the safety and security of the institution itself. Number 10. the outlandish escape from a Mexican prison. Joel David Kaplan was a New York businessman who had been arrested for execution in 1962 in Mexico City and was incarcerated at the Santa Martha Acatitla prison in the Iztapalapa borough of Mexico City. Joel's sister, Judy Kaplan, arranged the means to help Kaplan escape, and on August 19, 1971, a helicopter landed in the prison yard. The guards mistakenly thought this was an official visit. In 2 minutes, Kaplan and his cellmate Carlos Antonio Contreras, a Venezuelan counterfeiter, were able to board the craft and were piloted away before any shots were fired. Both men were flown to Texas, and then different planes flew Kaplan to California and Castro to Guatemala. The Mexican government never initiated extradition proceedings against Kaplan. The escape is told in a book, The 10-Second Jailbreak, the helicopter escape of Joel David Kaplan. It also inspired the 1975 action movie Breakout. At number 9, the escape of 3 Irish Republican Army members. On October 31st, 1973, an IRA member hijacked a helicopter and forced the pilot to land in the exercise yard of Dublin's Mountjoy Jail's D Wing at 3:40 p.m. 3 members of the IRA were able to escape: J.B. O'Hagan, Seamus Toomey, and Kevin Mallon. Another prisoner who also was in the prison was quoted as saying, "One shamefaced screw apologized to the governor and said he thought it was the new Minister for Defense. I told him it was our Minister of Defense leaving." The Mountjoy helicopter escape became Republican lore and was immortalized by the helicopter song, which contains the lines, "It's up like a bird and over the city. There's 3 men missing, I heard the warder say." Number 8. On November 3rd, 2019, Samuel Fonseca, 21, and Jonathan Salazar, 20, both convicted executioners, escaped from Monterey County Jail, located in Salinas, California. The 2 men escaped after using a hard plastic cleaning brush to knock a hole in the restroom sheetrock ceiling. The hole was in a blind spot in the communal bathroom that could only be seen by someone inside the restroom. They then escaped by going through the 11-inch wide hole, then through a maintenance gap between walls, and finally out a hatch that was kicked open, with the cameras nearby blocked by recent construction. After they escaped, they took off their jail suit. They were wearing street clothes underneath that allowed them to blend in as they headed to Tijuana, Mexico. Fonseca and Salazar had been in rival gangs and were not known to associate with each other before being housed in the same unit of the jail. Similarly, it is unknown why the 2 headed for Tijuana, how they made the 7-hour trip, and why they tried to re-enter the United States from Mexico around midnight 3 days after their escape, only to be arrested by the US Marshals on the border. Fonseca was accused of executing 2 men over 3 days in Salinas in June 2018. Salazar was arrested in the October 2017 shooting and passing of a Salinas man and the wounding of the man's wife while the couple drove in a Salinas neighborhood. Number 7. The escape involving what guards thought was an impossible stunt. In 1921, at age 22, Victor Folk Nelson made a sensational and highly publicized run and escape from a line of 13 prisoners after attending chapel at the Charleston State Prison. Despite an attempted intervening tackle from a prisoner trustee and bullets from a guard's gun, Nelson ran some distance, leapt, caught the lower end of the window bars, and scaled the 40-foot high wall of the prison's Cherry Hill section. At the top of the wall, he performed what was always believed an impossible stunt, throwing his body across a 10-foot space to the wall, where he managed to catch hold of the coping of a nearby structure and then to drop 30 feet down to the Boston and Maine railroad tracks. He was convinced to volitionally return to prison by his respected mentor and progressive penologist. His mentor was the only one to know of his whereabouts, meaning no one but Osborne found him until he turned himself in. Number 6. The infamous escape from Alcatraz. On June 11th, 1962, Frank Morris and the brothers John and Clarence Anglin, 3 inmates of the Alcatraz maximum security federal prison located on an island in San Francisco Bay, pulled off one of the greatest prison escapes in American history. After months of planning, they squeezed through air vents and made their way into the Pacific Ocean, where they boarded a raft they'd made out of stolen raincoats. They were never seen again. But their raft and paddles washed up ashore. Many believe the men drowned in the icy waters. The Anglin family insists the brothers survived and have presented evidence to prove it. The FBI can't quite figure out what to believe. Number 5. The only person to ever successfully escape and remain hidden from New York State Prison. On February 6, 1997, Victor Figueroa, a convict serving 1 to 4 years for substance possession, was supposed to be on the way to the mess hall when he wandered off from the Maria Shock incarceration facility. As soon as his absence was noticed, authorities secured the area, but the trail went cold. Authorities believed Figueroa passed away during the escape, most likely in a fall through a mine shaft near the facility. All anyone knows for sure is Figueroa was never seen or heard from again, and he's the only New York State prison inmate to escape and never be found. Number 4. In 1987, Glenn Stewart Godwin escaped from Folsom State Prison in California. He was serving a lengthy sentence for execution. According to the FBI, the agency still has him on its most wanted list. Later that year, he was arrested for substance trafficking in Mexico and sent to prison in Guadalajara. In 1991, he allegedly executed a fellow inmate and escaped yet again. He goes by a number of aliases, including Michael Carrera, Nigel Lopez, and Dennis Harold McWilliams, and is believed to be somewhere in Central or South America. The FBI is offering a $20,000 reward for information leading to his arrest. He has never been found and could still be out there right now. Number 3. On June 1st, 1971, Leonard Rayne Moses escaped after being granted a furlough from prison to attend his grandmother's funeral in the Homewood section of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. At the time, he was serving a life sentence for execution in connection with the Pittsburgh riots of 1968 that followed the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Moses remains at large and is still considered armed and dangerous. The FBI is offering a reward up to $10,000 for information leading directly to the arrest of Moses. This one is crazy. Imagine using your grandmother's funeral to escape from prison. I'm not sure if that's crazy or kinda smart. Number 2. The escape of a crime ring king. Omid Nino Tavili was the head of a Persian organized crime network in Canada. In 2007, while in custody, Tavili walked out of a maximum security prison in Canada's British Columbia wearing a janitor's uniform. He had the assistance of a guard whom he'd bribed to look the other way. The guard, whom Tavili never paid, was prosecuted, but Tavili remains an international fugitive. Tavili is also wanted in the United States in connection with a fraudulent telemarketing business that targeted the elderly. In 2017, Tavili, who is now almost 40, may have called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to negotiate his return to custody in exchange for a promise not to extradite him to the United States. And at number 1, a man with a plan. On August 22nd, 1970, George Edward Wright first escaped from a New Jersey prison. He was caught and put back in prison, only to escape again in 1972, and then he came up with a plan to avoid being re-imprisoned. On July 31st, 1972, Wright and accomplices hijacked a Delta airplane. After collecting ransom and releasing the passengers, Wright and his crew flew the plane to Algiers. In 2011, the police caught up with him in Portugal. Since Portugal has no extradition treaty with the United States, Wright was released and remains at large. Number 10. Catching crazy. Ada Barker had been an insane asylum nurse in El Paso, Texas, but in 1902, she became a victim of robbery and it was claimed she lost her senses after the ordeal. Having no immediate family in the area, the police placed the traumatized woman in the county jail until a judge could decide whether to wait until family arrived to claim her or simply send her to the insane asylum. According to the physicians who treated the woman after the robbery, Ada caught the crazy after being a nurse in an insane asylum and not because of the robbery. Number 9, she's not insane. In 1912, former insane asylum nurse Amelie Leonard escaped from the Worcester State Hospital for the insane. Previous to her incarceration in the mental hospital, she had been a nurse there. However, she was also a thief and was caught stealing valuables from the inmates. She was arrested and immediately the doctors said she had to be insane. Remember, nurses were prone to catching the crazy from their patients. Amelie was placed in the asylum, but she was obviously having none of it. One night she put her nightdress over her street clothes and tucked a roll-up blanket into her bed to look like she was asleep. She escaped through the asylum and into the night. Number 8. Bad nurses. An almshouse owned by the Marsh family in Massachusetts in 1883 had been taking in paupers and making them care for the insane patients sent to them. It was clearly a disaster. Insane women who were cared for by the pauper nurses endured the worst treatment imaginable. When it came to bathing, it was said that the nurses made half a dozen people bathe in the same water. To be fair, things are not all that great for the pauper nurses, but that's no reason to extend your pain onto others. Number 7. Zombie infection insanity? According to one popular theory in the early 1900s, insanity was contagious, like the flu or those fictional zombie movies. For example, in 1907, an insane asylum nurse at the Kings Park Insane Hospital in New York, Nellie Halpin, was bitten by a crazy patient. Shortly afterwards, the young woman showed signs of mental derangement. She was pronounced insane and sent to the psychopathic ward in Bellevue Hospital. I wonder what that deranged behavior was. Number 6. Accidental ignition. Oftentimes, nurses lived in rooms provided by the insane asylum. That was the case for Fairy Murphy in 1912. She had been a well-liked nurse at the asylum in North Dakota for 3 years and wanted to brighten the floors in her room. Fairy lit her alcohol stove and began melting paraffin wax, but by some freak accident, her hair caught on fire. She screamed and thrashed, causing her clothing to also light up. Nurses and doctors ran to her aid, but it was too late. After they put out the fire with her bed covers, they saw that her burns were deep and severe. She was not going to live. Being conscious and in extreme pain, Fairy was able to tell her co-workers what had happened and was able to leave a final written message to her mother and sister. Number 5. Cutting edge. In 1906, Nurse Wick was doing her job at the Matawan Hospital for Insane Criminals when one of her patients grabbed a pair of scissors and began stabbing her. How this patient got hold of the scissors is unknown. In all probability, patients were at that time allowed to use sharp objects while doing busy work prescribed by the doctors. Sadly, the nurse did not survive the attack, and no one really seemed surprised by the inmate's behavior. After all, the inmate had previously ended the lives of her mother, husband, and daughter. Number 4. Cruel and unusual. Creedmoor Psychiatric opened in 1912 as the farm colony of Brooklyn State Hospital and is still running in Queens. There are some places that have been abandoned to rot, most notably Building 25, which the hospital ceased using in 1975. This ward gained its reputation from a series of reports documenting brutal treatments of patients. In the 1970s, rumors began to emerge about an abundance of patient abuse, including executions, self-demise, and beatings. In 1984, a nurse's aide hit a patient in the throat with a blackjack. The man, Robert Venegas, was restrained in a straitjacket at the time and passed away due to asphyxiation. The aide had crushed his throat. At number 3, the body stain. Built in 1874 and originally intended for tending to tuberculosis patients, Athens Lunatic Asylum housed patients far over its capacity for many of its functioning years. This overcrowding caused the care for each patient to decrease until the hospital began abusing its patients. Athens, also called the Ridges, is notable because of its famed physician Dr. Walter Jackson. Dr. Jackson was a big fan of the transorbital lobotomy, calling it the cure-all for every mental illness. He performed over 200 lobotomies during his time there. While there were hundreds of passings when the hospital was open, the most famous is that of Margaret Schilling. She went missing while on the ward, and either no one noticed or no one cared. Over a month later, her body was found in a locked room in an abandoned part of the tuberculosis ward. Her body left a gruesome stain on the ward floor that can still be seen today. Number 2, ice therapy. Open to ease the overpopulation of the other 2 mental hospitals in Newtown, Fairfield Hills quickly overcrowded itself and resorted to unconventional methods of treating its patients. Aside from the then normal lobotomies and thorazine prescriptions, this hospital became known for its use of hydrotherapy. You're thinking that's not so bad, right? Not exactly. Used as a calming method, this treatment involved patients being submerged in ice water, sometimes for more than a full day. They were not permitted out, even to relieve themselves. At number 1, shell shock scare. The Trans-Allegheny Hospital opened its doors in 1864, just in time to begin admitting soldiers from the Civil War. At the time, there was no understanding of shell shock or post-traumatic stress. The doctors treated their understandably traumatized patients by doling out lobotomies and other brutal tactics. During the century it was running, thousands of patients passed away there. Most were buried in massive graves on the grounds, and its most famous patient, Charles Mason, lived there in the latter years of the hospital's functioning. After decades of mistreatment and abuse, the Trans-Allegheny closed its doors in 1994. You can now visit the Trans-Allegheny with one of their ghost tours. Maybe don't stay overnight though. Thanks for watching. Leave a like and comment if you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time on Crime Time.